Greetings, Professor McKee here with our next Seminar Saturdays video. And this week we're going to be talking about the reasons that institutional investors vote on shareholder votes. Because there are many votes that happen every year for each company, and investors are voting. Do I want this director to be on the board of directors? Do I want this person to not be on the board of directors? Do I approve this shareholder proposal? Do I approve this proposal by management? And it turns out we can actually see why they did it. So the paper is called Voting Rationales, a very bland sort of title, and it's by Roni, Michaely, Silvina Rubio, and Irene. My apologies for mangling those names. I'm sure I mangled at least one. And this was presented at Western Finance Association in 2025. So, as a reminder, WFA is one of the best conferences in finance for, well, just internationally as well as just in the US, and it's always somewhere west of the Mississippi. So, kind of in the West, although not always what we would think of as West. And this is a non-causal paper. They don't have some cool natural experiment to answer a research question. What they're really doing is just using an extremely novel data set and giving us lots of descriptive statistics about what's going on with this new data we have. So to publish a paper like this, it's really hard. And you would generally need either a really interesting and novel data set, which is what they have, or you need to be someone really, really famous in the field that you can get away with it. I don't think anyone on the author is a really, really famous person in this field, although I could be wrong because it's not exactly my area. But they definitely have a very novel data set. I've never heard of being able to look at this before, so it's pretty interesting, even though we don't actually find any causation here. It's a lot of just correlations and descriptive statistics. So shareholder voting, as a quick perhaps review, if you already know about things like this. Shareholders vote typically during annual meetings, although sometimes they have a special sort of vote outside of that, on a variety of proposals that will decide things for the company. But we don't know why they voted the way they voted. It's the same like in politics. You don't know why someone voted for a candidate or not, or voted for this other candidate, or voted for or against a ballot initiative. All you know is the yes or no. So the reason for why they voted for the proposal or against it is something we usually don't know about. But the authors, they have a data set where the institutional investors, which own a lot of the shares of these companies, are giving rationales for the shareholder vote. So they voted, and then they include a few sentences saying, this is why we voted the way we voted. Now, we don't have causality here, and it's important to keep that in mind because there is absolutely self-selection going on here. Most of the investors, even most institutional investors, don't state a rationale, or the rationale they give is just some generic meh, doesn't tell us anything at all. So they have about 1 to 5% of the voters giving rationale, and those voters control about 6 to 13% of the votes, depends on what year, what type of vote we're talking about, as in how many people are voting and how many votes they control. So investors are absolutely self-selecting into giving rationales, so we're not able to find causal effects for a rationale, although I'm sure people are going to try to use this database and find some sort of natural experiment to take advantage of it, because this would be a great way to get a paper and a great way to answer some interesting questions. But it does tell us that these investors are trying to signal to the company and to everyone else something using that rationale, assuming they're being truthful. And they do actually try to test to see if what they state as a rationale sort of lines up with other things that make it seem like it's really something that you would be concerned about or not be concerned about. So, when stating rationale, it seems like European companies are more likely to do it. The highest fraction of votes comes from European institutional investors, particularly Germany, although they have this asterisk here because there's one company called Alliance, very large institutional investor that is driving most of that. But U.S. investors are pretty low in terms of revealing why. There is likely national or European Union regulatory reasons why you might see big differences between countries. They also are going to be looking at something called robo-voters. Robo-voters are institutional investors who always, 99% or more, vote in lockstep with the major proxy advisory companies. So there's two major advisory companies, ISS and Glass Lewis, and on every shareholder vote, each vote, so every vote for a director, all the other things, they will give a recommendation. Say, this is how you should vote. There are a lot of investors and institutional investors who will just vote exactly what the proxy advisory says to do. And so, yeah, we might expect them to be different because they're just automatically voting the proxy recommendation. They don't really have a unique rationale. Their rationale is, well, ISS said this was a better way to vote than the other way, so that's what we're going to do. And indeed, when they look at robo-voter status, if you're not a robo-voter, you are more likely to give rationale. Now, you're still not very likely to give rationale. It's 4% versus 1 or 2%, but it is relatively quite a large difference. There might be some differences based on institutional investor type. Pension funds are the most likely to state the rationale, and fund managers, other investors, are lower. And it depends a lot on the type of vote that you are doing. So if you're doing a vote on who is going to be on the board of directors, which happens a lot, and there's a lot of directors being nominated every annual vote, it's going to be relatively lower. But if you're voting on a shareholder proposal, so some other shareholder was able to get enough votes to force a vote on some proposal, sometimes these are from activist investors that are trying to sort of reshape the company, Carl Icahn type things. Sometimes it's some investor that has a very deep interest in some particular thing. I've seen a number of climate change shareholder proposals. A lot of these, these are quite rare. Some of these can be kind of crazy and or sort of controversial proposals, and so they also are giving pretty high numbers are giving rationales. 12% of pension funds will give a rationale when they vote on a shareholder proposal, but they only do it 4% of the time when they're voting for a director. And again, European investors are showing up big time, 15%, 25% for shareholder proposals. There's also some UN responsible investing signatory things, and those tend to there's sort of a transparency principle that if you sign on to this thing, then you're going to be more transparent. Well, giving your rationale for voting seems to be one thing that they might be doing voluntarily. They're much more likely to give it than if they're not a signatory. But again, that's a voluntary thing. You self-select into it. They also looked at the big three. So big three just means BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Those are the three biggest asset managers. They have tons of mutual funds, and they have tons of assets under management compared to everyone else. They seem to vote less often than the smaller institutional investors. So, according to the authors, the most important characteristics for individual vote, to have a rationale, is if the vote is against the management's recommendation. Because if you look at any vote, you will always have a recommendation from the CEO and the current board saying this is how we think you should vote on it. Obviously, if it's something the management put on the ballot, they're going to say you should vote for it. But sometimes there's a shareholder initiative and the management says don't vote for this. We think this is a bad idea. It's going to hurt the company if you agree to it. Also, if it's a shareholder initiative, that's going to have a big impact. And indeed, we saw that there's double-digit percentage points of these institutional investors giving rationales when they vote on shareholder initiatives versus much smaller for other types of votes. And it does seem like investor policy, so the policy of that institutional investor, matters a lot, because there's a lot of consistency. So if you didn't vote last year, if you voted last year but you didn't give a rationale, you're not going to give a rationale again. If you did give a rationale last year, you're pretty high chance, 80+% chance, that you'll give another rationale again. So there's some institutional investors that have sort of appear to have chosen, like, we're going to give rationales. And some investors, a much larger group, that have decided we're not going to give rationales or have not considered doing rationales. So there's not a lot of flip-flopping within a institutional investor of, yeah, we gave rationale last year, we're not going to bother this year. They seem to be pretty consistent on if they give rationales or not. Okay, so the authors focus mostly on director elections. If you go back here, they have about 200,000 director elections. They have much lower numbers for shareholder proposals and management proposals. And remember, there's very small percentages that are giving rationales. So when you multiply that with the number of elections, there's not going to be that many rationales given for shareholder proposals, despite 12%. 12% times a much smaller number is not as big as 4% times a very large number. So they focus on that, and another reason they say to do it is because, well, every company has director elections pretty much every year, which is generally true. So if we're going to find something interesting and be able to apply it across many companies, that's where we would want to look, because shareholder proposals are much rarer. Other things by management are often one-off sort of things. And directors are just something that happens with everyone. There's a lot of commonality between companies about what you are looking for in a director. Okay, and in terms of classification, they use a AI LLM model LLM stands for model, right? So to classify voting rationale into broad categories. And they kind of walk through how they're doing this. So they manually reviewed a random sample of rationales, it's about 1,000 or so. And they came up with 12 categories based on the stated reasons in that random sample. Rationales could have multiple categories, but they were doing things like poor attendance of board meetings. So that's why we voted against this director, because he doesn't show up to meetings. Or busyness, the director is too busy with other jobs. Maybe he's a CEO of another company and he's on a board of directors of four other companies. We don't think he can actually show up to meetings because he's so busy. Or board diversity, that's one that showed up quite a bit. There's 9 other categories as well. And then the LLM took all the other rationales that weren't in that random sample and they fit them to the categories that the authors manually came up with. And I have actually done something similar with much smaller database of student responses, categorizing them, fitting them together. I didn't use an LLM. It was a much smaller sample, so you don't really need to worry about saving time and using an LLM to deal with 10,000 rationales when you only have 100 students in your class. But this kind of qualitative analysis, just categorize rationales, is a thing that can happen. And here are the rationales they had. So attendance, board diversity, if they're concerned about board structure, busyness of the person that they're voting against, CEO duality, this is generally a bad thing. This means the CEO is very powerful. Compensation of the executive, environment and corporate social responsibility. CSR is corporate social responsibility. If they're worried about it being independence. And a few other things, like if it's not things that were not very so rarely mentioned is sort of an other category, kind of rare concerns. They gave some examples here of like age. It was, this guy's 90. Maybe he should retire. worry that he's too old or way too old for this, or the CEO is currently being sued over something. Things like that are not very common reasons. How responsive they have been in the past to shareholder concerns. tenure. So if they have been on the board for too long, they're too too comfortable in their position there, and a few other things as well. And if I'm looking at these categories and I'm seeing tons of corporate governance concerns showing up, like almost all of these votes against for a director are all corporate governance. It's just corporate governance, corporate governance, corporate governance. I've seen so many papers talking about all these different things about board of directors. So when they give rationales, it does seem like the investors are really focused heavily on corporate governance concerns. Now, many times they don't give rationales, but if they do vote against and give a rationale, this is the reason that they're giving. They're worried about corporate governance. The board isn't going to do a good job of managing the company on behalf of them, as well as the other shareholders. Now, they do sometimes also give votes or rationales for votes for, and they have fewer categories. They did the same, very similar procedure. They talk about board diversity. If it's a cautionary vote, basically they said, yeah, we're going to do it, but we're not quite sure about it. So, we might not vote for you next time unless you shape up. They vote because they like that it's independence. They like that it's a new director. They like this person has experience. Sometimes experience is good, sometimes it's bad. This is one of the few things that shows up as a reason for both, and a few other sort of other ones as well. And a bunch of these are also related to corporate governance, independence, that it's a new director, has experience, but also board diversity, which some people say will be about related to corporate governance, some might not say that. Now, in terms of the frequency, they count them. And independence, board diversity are mentioned a lot. Things like attendance and environmental, corporate, social responsibility are mentioned much less. So there's definitely big gaps in which rationale is being used. But do keep in mind that there's a pretty low chance that you're going to see a rationale at all. So again, this is self-selected. And votes in favor were pretty much all about independence and board diversity and very little else. There was very often no reason given, or just a cautionary, which is pretty similar to no reason, but just less positive. Meanwhile, it's much more spread out. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negative reasons that were more than 10% of the rationale sample, and we've got a lot more concentration among votes in favor. So one thing they try to look at is if that stated rationale is a cheap talk and it's not actually connected to the true voting reason. Because this is a signal that the company can see, and you might be presenting a false rationale to conceal the real reason you didn't actually vote for the director. Or you vote against them and you say, well, I'm worried about independence, but the real reason is you're mad at this director because he did something last year that you didn't like. Or there's some sort of pet concern for you, and you state the reason, but it's not actually a problem. The company isn't really having an issue with independence or something. It's just that you're obsessed with this one metric and you claim there's an independence problem when there really isn't. So they're trying to sort of validate that the stated reason makes sense, and as to the extent that they can do that. Now, many rationales mention corporate governance. Corporate governance is something we've been studying in finance for a very long time. Very long time, pretty much from the very beginning of finance as a field. So we have all sorts of metrics to try and capture corporate governance already, and so that's what they're going to do. They're going to say, well, if the rationales are talking about corporate governance, are we seeing the company have bad corporate governance? So we have proportion of independence. So this is how many members of the board are independent, diversity, tenure. So these are all sort of things that they're talking about that might be related to corporate governance. And when the board is less independent, they start complaining about independence. When the board has fewer females, so it's going to be less diverse, they start complaining about it. When tenure is higher, they're talking more about tenure. So it does seem like, at least with the things that you can measure, they are actually connected to an attribute of the board that really exists. So like if directors really are busier, they have more board members, they're members on boards of other companies more often, that's going to show up as a reason more often. So these rationales are actually grounded in something that's really happening. And then they do a propensity score adjustment here. I mean, there are no real changes. They do look at like stock market performance, but nothing really is happening besides maybe some action with the board diversity. Otherwise, interacting board characteristic with the alpha of the company, the abnormal return, nothing's really changing. Now, presumably, if the rationale does actually match the corporate governance issue, the vote should be in the same direction, consistent with that rationale, right? If there's a, if there is a low diversity and they're talking about diversity, probably they're voting against non-diverse board member nominees. Or if independence is low and they're talking about independence in their rationale, they're probably voting against board nominees that are insiders, right? Like otherwise, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But we get to validate it. So we would expect basically the investors complaining about no independent directors. There aren't as many independent directors. They're probably going to vote against the directors that the CEO wants, assuming they're not independent directors. So if you have more independent directors, you're going to be bringing this up less. Yeah. So the interaction of high mention and board characteristics. So this is high mention means it's being this reason is being mentioned a lot, and the board characteristic is indeed that board characteristic. So things are consistent here except for the independence, right? So this interaction term is what we care about, and these signs match what we would expect if they're voting the way that they are claiming that they're worried about. Now, independence, as the authors kind of say, it is fuzzier to measure. It's hard to measure independence. You might, if you've been watching other videos that I've been doing on Seminar Saturdays, last semester, spring 2025, I had a paper on the CEO's social network. And I have seen other papers that have basically said, hey, look, while this director is technically an independent director according to sort of the regulation exchange rules, in reality, this director is, he goes to the same golf club as the CEO. They went to the same college. They have a bunch of social connections to the CEO. They're not like a true outsider. They're pretty friendly with the CEO. And so that might be one reason why we don't it's not as clear. There's not as a clear link with independence and voting that same direction, because they might the institutional investors might be aware that this board member isn't actually all that independent, but we might not be able to see it because the data we have about that director isn't capturing some of the softer social connections that the director has with the CEO. Okay, and one more thing to look at is if the companies change their behavior after they have all this rationale given. So if the investors vote no, and some of them are saying we're worried about board diversity, does the company do anything in response? Do they try to increase, in this case, board diversity next time? Or if they voted against it because of independence, does the company nominate more independent directors next time? So is this signal actually result? Is there a change in company behavior after the signal? We don't know if it's really causing. We can't really go with causality here, but is there a correlation with company changes behavior after they get the signal based on the rationale? And there's not anything going on really with independence. So there's a dissent on the vote, and our change in numbers of independence nothing happens there. But when they look at other things like board diversity, yes. If there's a dissent, diversity goes up next year based on who's being nominated. And I don't have the tables for the other ones, but for CEO power, like CEO is chairman of the board as well as CEO. Directors are tenured. Directors are too busy. Like the people that get nominated to be directors next time are they're more diverse measured by gender. They're less busy, so they have fewer other director jobs. They're not, it's not the CEO. CEO maybe steps off the board or steps down as chairman. If there's concerns about tenure, either it's too low or too high, like it changes. So they are seeing that the companies seem to change who they nominate to the board members in response from the previous year's rationale. Okay, so if the companies have done this, does that mean that the dissent voting no goes down when they make this change? Is this response of the company actually, is it satisfying the unhappy institutional investors who voted no and gave a rationale saying this is why we voted no? So how responsive is this? And the answer here is yes. So that if they addressed it, and the address score is a measurement of how much they addressed that rationale, the more they address it, the lower our dissent is next time. So this is now 2 times out, right? You dissented once, they change it, and now we're looking at did they dissent on that changed decisions for the next group of independent or any director for the board. And so yeah, they are, with a couple of different variations, they have alternate specification for this measurement of how much it's been addressed. They have propensity score matching type things going on, and the number of no votes goes down when the company is addressing that rationale. So it does seem like by addressing that rationale, they've been responsive to the shareholder vote, and the shareholders vote no less often. Now, I will just emphasize, like, it's very rare for a shareholder vote to fail. And one reason for that might well be there's a lot of ways for the shareholders to tell the management ahead of time. It's like, don't do this. If you do this, we're going to vote you down. So just, don't do it. And the companies seem to be responsive here in actually saying, okay, we won't do it. We'll change, which, as a matter of corporate governance, be kind of a good thing, right? We would like to see that. The idea for corporate governance is that the shareholders should be in the driver's seat in terms of being able to tell management stop doing this or start doing this, and management should actually listen and do what the shareholders want them to do. When management isn't doing what shareholders want them to do, or more subtly acting against the shareholders' best interest, that's what we would call a corporate governance problem. So this rationale seems to be a way that shareholders can signal to their employees, the management, hey, we want more independent directors, and we actually get more independent directors. Okay, so they run a few additional robustness tests on this dissent to rule out some alternative explanations for why the companies changed the board apparently in response to those voting rationales. So what if the boards are observing this concern independently of the rationale? And so all that really needs to happen is that there's no votes. You don't need to give rationales. Nope. If you interact just that there was lots of no votes, it doesn't show a shift in that specific governance concern. Is it being driven by the proxy advisors, the robo-voters, or the large institutional investors, the big 3? Well, they restrict the sample to remove those guys. It doesn't change anything. And the proxy advisors will say, hey, there's a corporate governance issue. Don't vote for this director. So like they will sometimes recommend no votes. And is it driven by direct communication to the company instead of that rationale? We can't observe the direct communication, but we know it exists. And so they try to restrict the sample to some cases where we believe or we know that direct communication is more likely, but results still hold there. And one thing I wanted to bring up here that the authors didn't talk about it too much, but I think it's an actual implication here, which is we saw that big three, Fidelity, Vanguard, State Street, they were given rationales less often than everyone else. And I feel like there might be something going on here where the biggest investors have an easier time doing direct communication. They have a lot more resources than a smaller institutional investor. As funny as it is to think about small institutional investors, because they're all real big, there's a lot of companies they're invested in. So those big three, they have more resources, and because they're bigger and they own a larger share of the company, they're more likely to be able to call up the CEO and say, hey, talk to me. I want to tell you about our concerns. But this rationale is an easier, cheaper way for a smaller institutional investor to say, hey, we are worried about this. We're not able to just call you up, the CEO, and tell you, and you won't pick up the phone for us because we're not important enough. Maybe, I'm not sure how much that works. But we do have enough votes that we matter. And we also don't have the resources to have a person to just go in and call up the CEO and go through all that effort of explaining our concerns. But when we actually vote, we can give a rationale. The CEOs are going to see that rationale because they're going to have to look at the vote. And that's a way for us to signal our concern, even though we're not one of the really big guys like Fidelity, Vanguard, State Street, who can use other methods of communication. So I have no idea if this is actually true or not. I just suspect it might be what's driving some of the things here, because there is the biggest companies are less likely to do this. So it seems like the smaller institutional investors are doing it, and I'm just trying to think of reasons why might the smaller institutional investors be more likely to give rationales, and that was my first hypothesis. Very much a hypothesis. Okay, so to wrap up this paper, again, there's a lot of correlations here, but there is no causality established. And I'll just, speaking kind of as my referee hat or future how well this paper will publish hat on, that is absolutely a barrier to publication. But this is a very novel data set. It's a really interesting one. It gives us new information about a field in finance that's been around forever, corporate governance. So I suspect they will be able to publish this. It's just going to be a little bit harder for them because they just don't have that causality, and some people are not going to like it for that reason. But I think this paper should get published somewhere, because just having a resource to say this is how we go get information about rationales and voting is really a really useful thing to have marked out in our field. And rationales for shareholder voting is rare. It seems to be increasingly common, like it's gone up over time, but it's still quite rare. But when it is showing up, it may be an information channel from the investors to the company saying, hey, we're worried about this thing. Now, again, there's no causality. There's no one randomly giving rationales or not giving rationales. So we can't prove that the information channel matters here. But there's some interesting correlations with that show, like when they talk about board independence, or maybe not board independence, but other things like board director busyness, it does seem like, yes, these directors are busier, and it seems like next time the company nominates people who are less busy, and there's fewer people voting no when they do that. And one thing I really noticed, which again I talked about before, like there's a ton of corporate governance concerns listed in the rationales. Many of these things are classic things we teach in classes. So our MBA students, the MBA guys who are going to be the ones both in management for the company as well as in management for the institutional investors, maybe they aren't actually sleeping through our classes. That's nice to think about. That's a nice thought, at least. All right, so that is everything for this week. And again, we're going to keep going through all sorts of papers from WFA. I have a huge list of interesting ones to pick from that I've planned out for the rest of the semester. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about the rationale for why institutional investors vote the way they vote on shareholder voting. And I'll see you all next time.